Lesson number 8 in our quarterly, Jesus, Master of Nature. Our memory verse is from Matthew chapter 14, verse 33. It says, "Then they that were in the ship came and worshipped him, saying, Of a truth, thou art the Son of God." What they said is of extreme importance because Jesus Christ, we recognize, is the Son of God. But these people actually lived on earth. They saw this man, Jesus, who looked just like them, walked around on feet, ate food, wore clothes, got cold in the wintertime, got hot in the summertime. What was unusual, special about him that would cause these folk to say, "You are the Son of God"? Something special about Jesus. And the events that caused them to say this is what we're going to look at today. Our lesson begins in Mark chapter 6, verse 30. You'll remember that Jesus had been in Nazareth, and he'd preached around Nazareth, and then he had sent out his apostles to the towns around to preach the gospel. Verse 30 says, "And the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus, and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught." So the mission trip that Jesus sent them out on was now over. They came back to Nazareth, and they were with Jesus here, and they were rehearsing the things that they had encountered there. I can imagine that was quite an exciting thing for them to do. That was the first time that they actually went out preaching and teaching, and it just had to be a wonderful thing. They'd seen Jesus teach, they'd heard Jesus teach, they'd seen the miracles that Jesus had done, and keep in mind, he had given them authority to teach the Word of God, and he'd given them authority to cast out spirits and things like that, and these are the things that they had experienced there. So they had a lot to tell him, I'm sure, and they were excited about it. We don't know how long they were out doing this. It may have been a week, may have been a month, who knows? We can only speculate. Verse 31 says, "And he said to them, Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place, and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat." Here Jesus is teaching his disciples a very important lesson. Certainly it's important to know what to teach and how to teach. Certainly it's important to know how to minister to people. But people don't realize that ministry is a very consuming task. It takes a lot out of people. I remember when I moved from Moore, Oklahoma to Rich Hill, Missouri to pastor the church there. One of my friends at the credit union where I was working was kind of making light of the situation. Says, well, you're going to be off 6 and off 1. In other words, you're off 6 days of the week and you only work 1 day of the week. Whereas, working for the credit union, I was working 5 days a week. Actually, that turned out to be 7 days on and 7 days on. Bivocational pastor work is very consuming, but any ministry is consuming. It takes a lot out of you. I remember Sister Phyllis Martin telling me one time that to preach a sermon, one sermon, and you don't think that standing up there for 30, 45 minutes speaking to people is very strenuous, But she said research has shown that that is as taxing on a person as working 8 hours. If you haven't been up there doing that, you don't realize that, because some people make it look really easy, but it does take a lot out of you. Now, I'm not trying to get your sympathy or make you feel sorry for me or anything like that, but there's a truth that in ministry, as in any occupation, you need to take some time off. And these men coming back, they were excited about what they'd seen. They'd walked these miles to these towns, and they'd encountered some stresses and like this. The adrenaline was really working. And, you know, in the things of God, in the work of the church, when things are going well, the adrenaline is really running. When things are slow and not going so well, then maybe depression begins to work. So it is good to get away for a while and rest a while. Jesus said to do that. You know, there are some places where they don't like their preacher to be gone any Sunday. They want him or her there every Sunday for every service. I remember Brother Harold Watson. Most of you probably don't even know who that was, but he was pastor of the Church of God in Phoenix, Arizona. They took off a whole month in the summer, and they would travel. And I tell you what, Phoenix, Arizona in the summer gets really hot. And so I can see why they would want to leave Phoenix and go someplace cooler. But there is some wisdom in that, because, you know, 11 months out of the year, you know, at least 3 services a week, plus the preparation for those services, the visitation, and all the things that go into ministry take a lot out of you. And being away from that, away from the town for a month, they really rested up, and when they came back, they were charged for the next year's work. So it's good when congregations will give their ministers time off, to take a vacation, to leave town, be away for a while to get rested up. A minister that is worn out, frazzled, is not as effective as a minister that is rested, has his mind and his faculties together, just able to teach, to help, to talk to people, to counsel with people, to do the things that are necessary. So physical rest is important in ministry, just as it is important in any job that you might do. Something also that was important here, it said that many were coming and going, so that these people had the disciples had no leisure so much as to even to eat. So there was something about them coming back and being around Jesus that attracted the attention of a lot of people. And they just wanted to be there to hear what they had been doing. Now, there was quite a crowd, because as we get into the lesson, we see that this crowd followed them, and it amounted to some 5,000 people by the time it all got together. But some of these people were from the little towns that these disciples had been to. They heard the gospel, they were attracted to it. Some undoubtedly believed the message and responded to it. And some were curious, what's going on? Let's go see this Jesus fellow. Or, you know, maybe some of the disciples, they want to hear these guys preach again. So they just kind of migrated with them. And just a lot of people right where this was. And here these disciples, they'd been preaching, traveling, and now all these people were here. Jesus says, okay, they will still be here. So let's go away for a little bit and get some rest. And it says he took them out to, it says a desert place. I don't think they went to Phoenix, Arizona. That's definitely in the desert. Really meaning a deserted place, or a place where there weren't any people, a place where they could just kind of sit down and relax, get some sleep, do some things that would just refresh them. So that was very, very important. We don't fully comprehend how closely our physical man and our spiritual man are related. But when you're worn down, when you're hurting, when you're sick, when you're tired, it drains you spiritually. You just don't feel like you're all there, right? We've all had those experiences, I know. And you need to rest that body, and it's amazing how the spirit revives. On the other side, the spirit needs to be in good shape. You need to be well. You need to be prospering in your spirit, because if your spirit is ailing, they'll drag your body down as well. Going on to verses 34 through 36. And Jesus, when he came out, saw much people and was moved with compassion toward them, because they were as sheep not having a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Now there's a couple of verses between what we just read and this verse here. And Jesus had moved up towards the Lake of Galilee there, and these people were following them. That's what's going on here. So he saw these people following him, and I like what Mark says, that Jesus was moved with much compassion. Christ is very compassionate. Not meaning to speak evil of Roman Catholicism or Catholics, but Roman Catholicism pictures Jesus as being harsh and strict and immovable. That's why they worship Mary, because they pray to Mary in hopes that she can intercede with Jesus and cause him to be nice to them. But Jesus is full of compassion. Where is Jesus right now? Well, Resurrection Sunday was just happened. We learned that he's not here, he's at the right hand of the Father. Well, what is he doing there at the right hand of the Father? He's making intercession for us. Christ is compassionate. He loves people. He's compassionate about every person in the city of Lawton, in Comanche County. He really cares, and he wants to minister to them. So here were these people, and he had compassion upon them. The first thing he saw was their spiritual needs. He said they were like sheep without a shepherd. That can really be a mess. Now, I've never been a shepherd, but I've read books on the topic that sheep are pretty dumb animals, and they really need a shepherd to look after them. And so Jesus saw these people, they're just kind of spiritually milling around, not knowing what to do with themselves. And he cared for them. And the first thing he did was he began to teach them, to help them spiritually. His first concern was not to feed them, not to give them money. And it's so many churches nowadays, they look on these physical, temporal things first before they consider spiritual things, if they consider those things at all. So Jesus put his priorities on the spiritual first. And in order to get these lost sheep together and going the right direction, he taught them many things. So I can imagine what he was saying to them took more than 15, 20 minutes, probably several hours. The people sitting there listening to Jesus teach them. Verse 35 says, and when the day was now far spent, what time does that conjure up in your mind? I'm sorry? Afternoon. Okay. I vote for evening. How many vote for evening? I think day far spent was evening, maybe even almost a twilight time. Anyway, it was pretty late in the day. It was late afternoon, that's for sure. So when the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desert place, and now the time is far past. I can just see them, you know. The people are sitting out there, some are standing, and the disciples, they're looking at their watches and they're getting concerned because guess what? Their tummies are telling them it's time to eat as well. They're tired, and so they come up to Jesus and they kind of tug on his robe and they say, the day's now far spent. And this is a desert place. And Jesus kind of looks at them and he's thinking, okay, all right, you're still human beings. I understand that. So what did the disciples say? They used very good human wisdom. There's 5,000 people out in this desert place. There's no McDonald's, no Burger King, not even a Taco Bell. Okay? So they say, send them away that they may go into the country round about and into the villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. Very logical, and logic is certainly good in the church. We need to be logical. A lot of people here, there's just no food. And these people, they came out here following you, listening to you, and they didn't bring any food with them. Jesus, we've got a problem. Okay? And sometimes in the church we worry more about the problem than we do the solution. Jesus is the solution. Keep in mind, he's at the right hand of the Father making intercession. He knows what's going on in your life. He knows what's going on in this little congregation. He knows what's going on in the neighborhood around us in this town. He is aware. And sometimes all we can see is the problem. And we get jittery and upset about the problem. And we really forget that he has the solution to the problems. So, going on into verses 39 through 42, Jesus doesn't do what they asked him to do. They said, send them away. But instead, he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and fifties. Now, I don't know how many of us here were ever in the military, but I do know some of us were. And we are familiar with squads and platoons and companies and battalions and divisions and regiments and things like this, because that gives order. And when things are done orderly, things go well. I remember in basic training, whenever they wanted to move our battalion into areas for training, we would line up by companies, and within our companies we'd line up by platoons, and in platoons we were in ranks, okay? So you had this long line of men, and the commander would say, forward, march, we all learned what our left foot was in basic training. And left foot first. And in order, it just so easy to move hundreds and hundreds of men at the same time to get to the same place. Order is good. Have you ever noticed that God is in order? Just look at nature, and you see that things have an order to them. We might at first think, well, it's all kind of random. You know, there's a tree there, and there's a tree over there, and there's a rock there, and a hill over there, and a valley over there. Well, what looks so random to us oftentimes is God's order on a greater, larger scheme. God is in order. And that's why in the church, you know, there's just one church, the body of Christ. You know, it's all over the world. It really is. But there's order within the church. That's why there's congregations. So that groups of people can be together. Because it's easier to minister to a small group than it is to a large group. You know, we hear of churches, mega churches that are 10,000, 15,000 people. I can't even begin to imagine that. But you know, for the real spiritual development of people, churches that large aren't good. Why? It's too big. It is too big. Smaller congregations are much more effective for the spiritual development of people because it's easier to deal with and teach a small group of people. I've often said that a congregation, to be effective, should never be more than 200 people. If you have more than that, you probably need to have 2 congregations rather than just one. Now, there's some people who shoot me down or throw rocks for saying that. But it's just the fact that it's easier to minister to smaller groups. Those in ministry can be much more aware of what's going on. They're much more easily approached. They have more time to devote to people. You know, when people have needs, you know, they want their minister there. They want to talk to them, want to counsel, they want prayer. They have questions. And, you know, if you're in a church of 15,000 people, you're so far removed from the ministry of the church that you're just kind of out in left field. So Jesus tells us that order is good. Sit down in groups of hundreds and fifties because it's going to be easier to distribute food to groups like this. Well, where is he going to get the food? Mark doesn't tell us, but John does, that there was a little boy that did happen to bring his sack lunch. He had a few little barley loaves and a few dried fish. Now, this is very common food for this part of the country. Dried fish was a staple because they had the Sea of Galilee right there. Remember, Peter, James, and John were fishermen. That was what they did. Every day they'd catch fish. And these fish were preserved by drying and salting them. So that's how they ate. And then bread was another staple. And these had been just really small little loaves, about this size here. So when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes from this boy's lunch, 5 loaves and 2 fishes. How are you going to feed 5,000 people with 5? You know, that's 1,000 people per loaf of bread. This. Come on, how are you going to do it? Well, he looked up to heaven, he blessed and brake the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them, and the 2 fishes he divided among them all. Now, what we don't see here is that he blessed this, and he put some in a basket of each of the 12 disciples. Okay? Verse 42 says, and they did all eat and were filled. So as the disciples were going out to these groups, reach into the bag, they'd break off a piece of bread, they'd break off a piece of fish, next piece of bread, piece of fish, like this, and next row, and they just kept reaching into the basket and pulling out bread and fish. And all 5,000 people were fed. And we also learned that there were leftovers in the baskets. How in the world did this happen? I don't know. You explain a miracle. This is a miracle. And this shows something about this person, Jesus, that these people had never seen. They'd heard him teach. They'd seen him cast out spirits. They'd seen him heal sick people. And that's something to take for granted, I guess. But now, over this limited quantity of food, Jesus makes it possible to feed 5,000 people. And surely this is the only time in history this has ever happened, right? Well, no, there's another time when Jesus feeds another group of people. But there are recorded instances when miracles like this have happened. There was a dear lady, Etta Faith Stewart. She was a missionary in India for some time. And she went over there without the blessing of any church. She was a Church of God lady. God called her. She went over there on her own. Eventually, the fellowship began to help her out. But she had a passion for young girls. She would rescue girls from the temples. And see, this is a good thing because these girls are being sold into prostitution in the temples, a lot of times by their fathers, or they were orphans on the street and like this. And it broke her, Sister Stewart's, heart to see these young girls treated in this way. So she started a girls' home. And she would rescue these girls. And then she brought them into the home. She would teach them the scriptures. She would teach them sewing and cleaning and little trades so that they could, be self-sufficient. And also, she did evangelistic work in the community where she would. And she always had this Christmas service that she had at the girls' home there. And she invited people in the community in. There'd be a program, she would bring a message, and then they would have a meal. Well, this mission was faith supported. In other words, they didn't get a check from the Church of God Mission Society. They prayed the food in. And they only had enough food for one pot. And they had cooked that up, the girls cooked that up, and on that particular day, the house was just filled with people. How in the world are we going to feed all these people out of one pot of stew? Sister Stewart told the girls, pray. So they'd get a bowl and they'd dip the stuff into it and they'd take it out there and they'd dip it. And they just kept dipping. They'd bring the bowls back, clean them up, kept on dipping, fed all the people. That really happened. And there are other stories like that that I've heard of. So Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, always making intercession for us. So he has compassion on people. First thing he wants to do is take care of their spiritual needs. And then take care of whatever physical need is there that he can help. And keep in mind, the mission of the church is not to meet people's physical needs. We're here to meet people's spiritual needs. But at the same time, we can do physically for people what we can do. You know, as a congregation, we will help people that we can help. We have given food, we've given money to help people. Right now, you know, we've adopted the Salvation Army as our mission. So we take up mission offerings to give to them. That's all we can do. So, verse 46. Some time went by, the people finished their food. Verse 46 says, and when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. Jesus found it necessary to pray. If Jesus found it necessary to pray, how important is it for us to pray? Do we pray enough? You know, I read something the other day. The measure of the effectiveness of our prayers is the answers. So how effective are our prayers? Where are the answers? If Jesus found it necessary to pray, how much more do we need to pray ourselves? Spiritual life is more important than physical life. But I promise you, most of us eat our 3 meals a day and then probably a little more. Do we take the time to pray at least once a day? If we didn't eat physical food, how healthy would our physical lives be? What happens if you don't eat food? Huh? You die. So what happens if you don't pray spiritually? You're going to be really strong and healthy and effective in the kingdom of God, right? No, you're going to die. So we need to pray. If Jesus prayed, we need to pray. Brother Weindorf says, to keep spiritual life flowing is the secret, praying is the secret of keeping it alive, strong, and effective. Okay, now verse 47 to 51. Jesus prays, and then it's time to leave. He sent his disciples on ahead in a boat. It's called a ship here, I think, but it's a boat, a fairly large boat across the Sea of Galilee. All right? And when even was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. So by himself on the land, the disciples were out on this boat. And he saw them toiling in rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the 4th watch of the night he cometh unto them. How did he do that? Walking upon the sea, and would have passed them by. Now, he walked about 3 miles, the notes say, from where he was on the land, out across the middle of the Sea of Galilee where this boat was, walking on the water. But when they saw him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and cried out. For they all saw him and were troubled. And immediately he talked with them and said unto them, Be of cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And he went up unto them into the ship. And guess what happened? And the wind ceased. Wow. And they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. Just because the wind stopped? We live in Oklahoma. We get a lot of wind down here. And when the wind stops, are we sore amazed? No, we say, thank goodness. I'm glad it stopped for a while. Okay, so these guys were amazed, shocked. Well, what Mark doesn't tell us, John tells us. Because when he got into the ship and the wind stopped, the boat was immediately where they wanted to go, which was the other side of the lake. How many have ever seen the Star Trek TV shows? Scotty, beam us up. Well, this was kind of like Jesus beaming them from the middle of the Sea of the Galilee up there to Capernaum. Boing. And they were amazed and they wondered. Here's this physical miracle that happened to them. The storm stopped. And all of a sudden they were where they were heading for. A miracle. Verse 56. And whithersoever he entered into villages or cities or country, they laid the sick in the streets. They besought him that he might touch, if it were but the border of his garment, and as many as touched him were made whole. No secret that Jesus healed people. And thank God he still does that today. Remember, he is at the right hand of the Father making intercession. People see these miracles of him taking sick people and making them well. Now, we read our memory verse, and in the end of it, it says, of a truth, thou art the Son of God. What made people say that? Well, we saw three things here today. The feeding of the 5,000 people. We saw the power that he had over natures and stopping the storm and making the boat go where it was intended to go. And he see Jesus healing sick people. That was enough to convince people that Jesus was not just a rabbi, not just a teacher, not just a prophet sent by God, but that he truly was and is the Son of God. But you know, the greatest proof that he is the Son of God isn't in the miracles that can happen physically around us. It's in the miracle of salvation, where when we humbly come to him, place our faith in what he did for us on the cross, and ask for forgiveness and cleansing from sin. That moment that we believe, and he miraculously changes us, makes us a new creation. That convinces me that he is truly the Son of God. It convinces me that he is risen. It convinces me that he is at the right hand of the Father. Amen.